But he also notes that femininity plays a crucial role in supporting the masculinity of war by women doing support roles and sort of taking gender roles that reinforce that war is a masculine thing. And so even the women's peace movement is, in a sense, emphasizing that war is a masculine thing, right? And in fact argues that the women's peace movement is probably counterproductive, because what it winds up doing is reinforcing that if you're a real man, you favor war, because women are the ones favoring peace. What?
That's kind of what I thought was really interesting about it. As he goes off and like lists off every reason, it's really interesting because before this class I never actually looked at it as a whole and thought about like there's so much ingrained in society that like adds up to this. Because you don't think about it until you start picking it apart and actually look at like all the different components and how they like interconnect to make this bigger picture. So I thought that is kind of interesting. And I do think there's probably like other factors and stuff too, but it's a quite a good argument, I thought. So.
Any other thoughts on that?
This may have just like kind of being there and also like kind of influence writing of like the things like sort of inspired her, like the US gave her son that shield was like come back with your shield or on top.
Or on it, yes. Yeah. Yes. Who was that? Was that like Agamemnon's wife or something?
No, because it was Spartan, but I think it was
okay.
like actual. Is that sounds like not a Mestro would say, but go ahead. It's an actual quote. Or actual.
No, we can look it up.
Yeah, I'm sure we're on to this right.
Actually, the internet will probably tell us it was from Abraham Lincoln, but you've seen that great little meme. It shows a picture of Abraham Lincoln that says, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." Abraham Lincoln.
Why does everything just say that Abraham Lincoln said it?
Well, in Saving Private Ryan, they showed us that if you just say Abraham Lincoln said it, it has the words, becomes the gospel of God handed down from on high.
Apparently, it's just a famous saying from Spartan Mother, according to Google, but nobody knows who said it or if it was.
Here's where we really need a time machine. We can go back and figure out who the hell said that first.
Don't they play that bit in, what is it? The Hateful Eight, too?
I haven't seen that one.
Oh, they're like, I think it's like Samuel L. Jackson's character has a letter that he says is from Lincoln, and then one of the guys finds out at the end that it's like not actually from Lincoln. It's just like a bullshitter. It's like a plot point.
My family, my mother's side of the family, has a really dumb sort of family tradition, and I say this as a historian, but my great grandfather was a messenger boy as a 14-year-old in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, and he shook Abraham Lincoln's hand at one point. And then he made a point when he had kids to shake each one of his kids' hands and say, "You're one handshake away from Abraham Lincoln." And my mother has shaken my hand and said, "You are now 7 handshakes or 6 or whatever it is away from Abraham Lincoln." Although I get to jump the queue because I shook her dad's hand, my grandfather's hand. So I'm actually one closer than I ought to be.
Well, okay, I gotta do that. I'm several handshakes away from Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Nice.
My great grandfather was a Anglican minister in Prince Edward Island. And she came for a tour at some point, and I have a photo that on the day she passed away my first year, my grandma just threw this into the family group chat, and it's just a photo of him with I don't know when the photo's from, but it's 100% her.
Sure. Nice. Any other thoughts on?
That wasn't very relevant. I just wanted
That's okay. I had the thing about Abraham Lincoln and handshakes wasn't very relevant either.
That's very relevant to the movie we were watching.
As a class, we get so distracted so frequently, and I kind of love it, Compton. We start talking about such random things that would never come up in a normal history class.
Well, you should enjoy this is the last class, the last dance, so.
Would you like to see the photo?
Sure. Since we're going totally down this rabbit hole, let's go down the rabbit hole. Wow.
Yeah.
Is he hitting on her?
I don't think so.
Looks like he's flirting.
Okay.
Oh.
It was just like, grandma just threw it up and we were like, grandma.
And that's interesting historical document because it's proof that Queen Elizabeth was not 90 plus years old her entire reign. So-
Yeah.
I do like the thing points of, my own, like, I think they've started making the Charles one, but no, I haven't seen one anywhere, which is fine. I'm like, just keep your other money, it's more fun.
Yeah.
But it is fun. This obviously they change the stamp every couple of years, so
Yeah,
you
sure.
can always tell kind of how old your money is based on how the Queen looks.
Yes, by how old the Queen is.
It's fun.
Any other thoughts on masculinity, war, femininity, war, and war?
Who's the
Masculinity,
king
femininity?
right now?
Pardon?
Charles.
King Charles?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is he doing okay?
Yeah.
Like, health-wise?
He's got cancer.
Oh,
Prostate
okay.
cancer.
Okay, I feel like I've heard that.
When did that happen?
It was announced like 5 months ago or something. And it's probably the type of prostate cancer that's not very aggressive and they're not very worried about it. And they're probably having a conversation with him like, according to the actuarial tables, you're going to die of something else before this kills you, so we're not going to do anything. But-
Okay.
It's pretty old.
Well, that's actually a conversation that's very common, that prostate cancer, one type of it is very slow growing, and so often men in their 70s and 80s get diagnosed with it, and they're like, something else is going to kill you first, we're not going to worry about it. It's like, well,
Interesting.
that's not as cheerful as it sounds.
Mhm.
I think maybe that's how Gerald in the photo passed away.
Oh, really?
I think maybe. I can't quite remember
All right. Well, let me talk a little bit more about women in World War II.
that. Sorry. I guess Queen Elizabeth is irrelevant because she was a woman in World War II.
She was.
There I go. It's topical.
So I talked last time about how World War II was different in the impact it had on women, that many, thousands and thousands of women died in World War II because combat reached places where women were in ways that World War I combat never did. First, because World War II had massive bombing campaigns which killed women as well as men, and second, because the war was a war of motion, and so women often found themselves in combat zones that had rolled over them and were killed in combat zones as collateral damage, as it were. But I mentioned last time that just like in World War I, World War II was a total war, and it required women to keep the economy going while men disappeared in the armed forces. And like World War I, but to an extra degree, an order of magnitude difference, World War II, the numbers of mobilizations in World War II were way higher than World War I. The number of people who were mobilized for the war and the number of people who were killed in the war. I mentioned in here that about 19 million people died in World War I, and 10 million of those died from the Spanish flu in 1918. In World War II, the number is somewhere between 55 million and 90 million, and it probably 75 is a pretty reasonable estimate right now for the number of people killed. And just to give you some idea of how different countries are hit hard. I mean, the United States had, 420,000, 440,000 dead in World War II. The Soviet Union had 20 million dead in World War II, which is more than all the countries lost in World War I all combined, including the Spanish flu, was 19 million in World War I. The Soviet Union had 20 million killed in World War II alone. So, given that way more people wound up in the military, and given that the military industrial complex required even more industrial production, countries had to scramble to find women and get them into the workforce to replace men. And I want to focus on the United States here for a little bit because we didn't talk about that too much in World War I. So the United States enters the war in December of 1941 and right after Pearl Harbor. Early 1942, FDR creates the War Manpower Commission, which ironically dealt with women. And then the Office of War Information, which was the propaganda office. And the propaganda office's job was to convince women to enter the workforce and to convince companies to hire them. And this became one of the big dynamics in the United States in particular, was that it wasn't just that they had to convince women to apply for jobs, women who were middle class and didn't think they should be working. It was also that they had to convince companies to hire them because companies hiring managers didn't believe women could do it. But it really did work. In 1942, the United States actually predicted they were going to be short 6 million workers, meaning when they mobilized for war and drafted millions of men, they predicted they were going to have 6 million jobs they had to fill that they wouldn't have men to fill. And so that basically meant they needed 6 million women to enter the workforce. And so the War Manpower Commission began to put pressure on employers to hire women. And as I mentioned, this is real resistance because there was a really deeply ingrained idea that women simply couldn't do men's jobs. Listen.
What was the exact number?
6 million?
Thank you.
There was a really deeply ingrained idea that women simply couldn't do men's jobs. Women were not seen as rational enough or hands-on enough or strong enough or just a general level of competence. There was an idea that anything having to do with machinery women couldn't do. Right? And so the Office of the War Manpower Commission, really, its biggest job turns out to be convincing companies that women can actually do these jobs. And then the Office of Wartime Information, of course, invented two characters, Wendy the Welder, who has fallen away from history and nobody remembers, and Rosie the Riveter. And Norman Rockwell, of course, did a famous picture of Rosie the Riveter, which became, or a whole series of pictures of Rosie the Riveter, which became, the standard image of women in the workforce. I assume you've all seen pictures of Rosie the Riveter? Okay. The most famous one is her rolling up her sleeve like this. And there was an interview with the artist who drew it, and he said he actually was thinking of this, which is the British middle finger, basically, when he was doing it. But so before the war, 24% of the workforce in the United States was women. So basically, there were 3 men for every woman in the workforce, and that's working class women. And most of the women in the workforce were domestic servants, cooks, or secretaries, elementary school teachers, a fairly small slice of jobs that were considered women's work. Nurses, etc. But during the war, the percentage of women in the workforce increased to 37% in the United States. And by 1945, if you looked at the military industries, 65% of the workforce was women by 1945. So 2/3 of the war industry workers were female by 1945. That's about 310,000 women worked in defense industries.
Yeah, Wendy the Welder just isn't as cool.
I know, right? One other point I just want to make in passing is that the war also created massive employment opportunities for disabled people and African Americans. Both groups were largely excluded from good jobs before the war, but the desperate need for workers in the war industry meant that, first of all, 200,000 disabled people found work during World War II in war industries. And one company, the Supreme Engineering Corporation, which made aircraft parts, had 95% of the employees were in wheelchairs. I suppose once you've retrofitted the factory for wheelchairs, you might as well just keep hiring. But 95%. And airplane manufacturers actually discovered, this, I don't know how to think about this, but they began to hire little people. They called them midgets at the time, but they began to hire little people because there were places inside airplane wings where you needed to do welding and riveting that only they could fit. And so instead of hiring children, you hire little people.
Were the people in wheelchairs, were a lot of them World War I veterans?
I don't know, that's a good question.
Okay.
I mean, it would not surprise me at all. It's 20 years later.
Yeah, I'm just wondering
Yeah.
why there were so many. I mean, maybe like polio. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, there weren't that many people in wheelchairs, but this one company might have had 300 employees, and
Okay.
290 even more in wheelchairs.
That still feels like a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe like disabled people are just like underrepresented in the public, so we don't really see them. But there's like a lot of people in wheelchairs.
Yeah, could be. I mentioned this before, but I'll just mention again that African Americans also saw a dramatic increase in their wages during the war because they began to move from unskilled labor that they were confined to before by discrimination. They began to find that suddenly skilled labor was opening up for them, and higher paying jobs in factories were opening up for them, and that they could enter mixed race workplaces in ways they never could before. And in particular, as I mentioned, there was a massive migration during World War II from the Deep South to California, the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt cities, and New York. So Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, etc., and New York. And this is the end of the Great Migration that really begun during World War I when African Americans began to move north. World War II kind of completed it. One other thing I'll mention is that a lot of industrial cities, because the war industry took off so much, a lot of industrial cities suddenly exploded in size. Seneca, Illinois, it's right in Chicago basically, had a shipyard that began to take on business for the Navy. And before the war, the population was 1,235 people, but during the war it was 27,000. Try fitting, 200 times the number of people into your city. Mobile, Alabama got 80,000 new residents in 1942 alone. So, I mean, some cities were just growing dramatically. And this led to a situation similar to what you see at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where you suddenly have largely rural populations moving to these cities in search of work. And there's a real breakdown in social mores and morals, because in small towns, people sort of keep each other in line. Everybody knows everybody, as they're watching everybody, knows everybody's business. But you suddenly go to a city, a new city like this, with these massive factories and everything, and nobody knows what the rules are, and the rules are kind of in flux because nobody knows what they are, and it takes several years for new cultural rules to emerge. And so there really is a sort of an anything goes kind of crazy atmosphere to these boom towns. Los Angeles just exploded in size. Long Beach and San Francisco are the two major ports for the Pacific, and so the entire war effort flowed through San Francisco and Long Beach. And Southern California was the home of the American aviation industry also, McDonnell Douglas and et cetera. Boeing was up in Seattle, but questions about any of that? Now, when women did, there was a lot of resistance to women entering the workforce, and for some reason there's a lot more literature on World War II, historical work on World War II than World War I. It might just be better documented, so historians have found this stuff. But male factory workers often refused to work alongside women. And a key part of this was they felt that if women could do their jobs, then they must be women's jobs. And for men, some men, that was considered humiliating, that they suddenly found themselves in a woman's job, and so they refused to do it. And even if women were hired anyway, there were endless reports of men groping women, sexual harassment, teasing, even sabotaging women's work, sabotaging the machinery so they couldn't do their jobs, sabotaging their tools, stealing their tools, losing their tools, etc. And it was incredibly hostile in some workplaces for the women entering these workplaces, but the government kept pushing. And the women, in many cases, kept pushing, and they had to make it work. But there was also resistance from women, and we'll see this when we get to next week when we start on Since You Went Away. we'll see that one of the key resistances of middle-class women entering the workforce and working in factories in particular was that they thought it would defeminize them. They thought it would make them failures as women. And so there was a whole, the government, and part of the Rosie the Riveter, Wendy the Welder campaign was to try to present an image of a female industrial worker that still was feminine. And to convince women that they could do this. And there were even articles, probably prompted by the Office of Wartime Information, but articles in fashion magazines and things about, the best nail polish for wearing in the factory, or articles about women, how hairstyles women could have in the factory so their hair didn't get caught in the drill press, or and so they're trying to make it as feminine as possible through makeup, etc. Why?
I think there's an interesting parallel because you get these propaganda photos of very strong women, kind of masculine build. But then also on airplanes and stuff, on the side of airplanes, they're painting these really elaborate, beautiful women kind of lounging on their side. This is
Yes.
what we're fighting for and stuff. So I think that's just kind of an interesting parallel in the way in which they're being displayed in propaganda and artwork during the time.
Yeah, and and part of the reason I suspect for that, the Goldstein had a little bit about using women on the side of airplanes and things, and women as sort of emblems, highly sexualized women, as emblems of what soldiers were fighting for, as a way of, showing soldiers what they were fighting for, giving them a sort of fantasy world to what they were fighting for. But I think Rosie the Riveter was intentionally made a little bit huskier to show strength. Because one of the things the Office of Wartime Information ran into was that women didn't think they could do the jobs. Women didn't think they were capable because they'd internalized the entire gender dynamic up until that point, which was that women are not capable of that sort of thing, and especially using tools and machinery, etc. Women can't do that. There was no explanation for why women couldn't do that, but it had been deeply internalized that was unfeminine and women can't do that. And so one of the things the Office of Wartime Information had to do is convince women they could. And part of that was convincing them that they were physically strong enough, but part of it was also convincing them they could be competent, and part of it was convincing them they wouldn't lose their femininity if they did, right? So it becomes an interesting question, and we will see this in Since He Went Away. This was written with basically a government propaganda film. It was made by a Hollywood studio, but it was definitely made in cooperation with the Department of Defense. And they address that issue explicitly, and they try to come up with an answer for women for why you can do this, et cetera. So it's an interesting question. Any questions about that? I think we should probably dive into the movie. I don't remember how much is left, but it's over an hour and a half. So, so let's take a 5-minute break, and then we will talk or watch the rest of Thin Red Line.